would you do if deep in the woods you stumbled upon the skeletal remains of a missing person and a memory card filled with hundreds of photos, showing a towering creature over 7 feet tall, carving "Stay away" into a tree? The shocking truth: that creature isn't the killer. It's been trying to warn us, but about something far more dangerous and entirely man-made. I'm Elena Cruz, a field biologist. Alongside a former combat medic, I uncovered evidence that even experienced rangers had missed. In the next 60 seconds, you'll discover who's really behind the mysterious deaths, why the creature arranges human belongings, and what the rhythmic wood knocks actually mean. Survivor Caleb North, a young survival vlogger, claims the creature saved his life, treated his wounds with herbs, and taught him rituals to respect the hunted. That doesn't sound like a monster. If you skip this story, you'll keep believing the lie planted by those destroying the forest for profit. But if you stay, you'll learn to read the forest's warnings before it's too late. I heard it before I saw anything. 3 knocks, deep and hollow, carrying through wet cedar and fog like someone striking the belly of the woods. My camera slipped off my shoulder and thudded into the spongy ground, lens cap skittering under a carpet of sword ferns. The sound hung there a second longer than it should have, the way thunder sometimes lingers in valleys out here. I told myself it was a woodpecker. I told myself a lot of things in those first minutes. We were a few miles into Olympic, where the road gives up and the map turns into contour lines and guesswork. Tom walked ahead of me, slow and deliberate, like the forest had an old deal with him. He's 68, a former combat medic who still moves like every footfall is a promise. I'm the biologist on this patrol, the one who traded a lab bench and fluorescent lights for rain, mud, and elk collars that pinged my phone with patient little heartbeats. We'd come to check a collared cow that hadn't moved much since last night. That was the plan. Plans always sound reasonable at trailheads. The fog was that dense, pearly kind the Pacific throws inland before noon, beating on my lashes, turning strands of spider silk into silver ropes between huckleberry branches. Every sound was a little louder in it, water tapping off hemlock needles. The soft hiss of my breath in a cold mask of air. Somewhere downslope a creek muttered under boulders the size of minivans. I knew this place like a doctor knows a familiar heartbeat, and still my skin felt new and thin inside it. We found the elk sign first. Fresh scat, clipped salal, a tuft of gray-brown hair snagged on a broken twig. The GPS collar said she was 60 yards away, just over a fold where the ground pitched steeply down. Tom lifted a hand and I stopped. He listened with his whole body, shoulders easing forward. Another 3 knocks. Slower now. Not woodpecker fast. Not random. Like a code that assumes you already speak it. The slope fell away into a bowl of nurse logs and blowdown. Everything soft with moss, every edge rounded. That's where I saw the first bone. A radius, long and pale and out of place, tucked against a log as if someone had set it there for later. I didn't reach for it, I made myself look. It's a discipline I teach my interns. Hold the scene. Catalog the obvious before you disappear into it. There were more pieces, half hidden in deer fern and salal. A fragment of skull with a zigzag crack. 2 metatarsals side by side. The curve of a pelvis under rotted maple leaves. Human, without question. My throat closed the way it does right before you say a name you haven't spoken in years. 2019 rose in me like cold water. My brother's year. The year I learned what a sheriff's voice sounds like when it's trying to be kind. Tom didn't touch anything either. He made a slow circle with his eyes, clocking what I was clocking. No drag marks, no scatter pattern like a cougar's cache. Bears leave scoring, parallel grooves where molars compress and slide. Cats leave punctures V-shaped, neat as staples. The edges here weren't chewed, They were granular, pulverized in places, cortical bone gone to chalk along hairline fissures. I've spent enough time with bones to know when teeth are lying. This was pressure, sudden and immense. Not animal, not clean. My brain grabbed for comparisons. Rockfall, equipment, blast shock. And then I heard the creak again. The way it rattled the smallest stones like a jar of marbles when microquakes wiggled through this ground. USGS had mapped a rash of those tremors here over the last few years. Small, forgettable things. Unless you were standing under an unstable face at the wrong time, elk tracks cut through the mess, fresh and sharp. The cow we were tracking had skirted the edge of the bowl, careful as a tightrope walker, and moved on. I eased around a rotting log to follow, and saw the dark slit of an opening where two boulders leaned together. A shallow rock cave you'd miss if you weren't looking directly at it. Something glinted inside, not metal. Plastic, maybe. Tom went first, shoulders angling so his pack didn't scrape. He reached in and came out with a little SD card cupped in his palm like a robin's egg. There are a dozen reasons a memory card could be in a place like that. Hikers cache strange things. Storms wash stranger things downslope. But this wasn't lodged in silt or leaf mold. It had been set on a flat of stone beside a neat row of other objects I tried not to catalog all at once. A cracked watch face, a lighter that wouldn't light, a lens cap, a patch from a backpack shoulder strap, a plastic whistle. None of it hidden. All of it arranged the way you'd lay out items you're trying to remember for someone else. I carry a field tablet for collars and camera traps. It's rugged enough to bounce off a rock and survive the story. I slid the card into the adapter with hands that pretended they weren't shaking and thumbed through the thumbnails. The first frames were what you'd expect from a backcountry point-and-shoot. Trail selfies, a ridge in blue layers, a hand that looked young and dirty and happy, a tin cup held up to a sunlit creek, then the frame that didn't belong. The floor at an angle, fern fronds in the corner, a rectangle of sky, the black curve of a lens hood tumbling into view. The camera had fallen and kept shooting, a quiet machine stubbornly doing its job on the forest floor. I scrolled. The angle didn't change for a while. Shadows lengthened. A millipede crossed like a train. The air thickened to late day. And then something filled the frame, not like an animal stumbles into a shot, but like a person steps into a doorway. Hair first. Dark and dense, not fur exactly, more like a heavy coat bristling with water. A shoulder that ate the corner of the image. The slope of a head that wasn't where I expected it to be, higher. The crown out of frame. A hand entered, palm toward the lens, not to slap it away, but steady. The fingers were long, the nails dark. There was dirt in the creases and a braid of something pale looped around the wrist like a cuff. Bast fiber, I realized later, peeled and twisted from bark the way I'd watched old-timers make cordage. The hand lifted the camera. The shot went dizzy, sky ground sky. It settled again at a new angle facing a standing trunk where someone had carved letters in a rough, decisive hand. Not a someone, something. That's what my brain offered to keep my world intact. Except the letters were English. Except the carving was deep and fresh. Except it said exactly what every primitive part of me had been hearing since we stepped off the road. Stay away! There were other marks behind the words. Grooves that curved and echoed themselves. Patterns you could miss if you were only reading the English. Nested arcs, diagonal crosshatches, little runs of dots and threes. The camera held steady as if whoever, whatever was giving me a second to understand. Then the angle shifted again and filled with 8 feet of what the old stories call a monster. But the footage made looked tired and alert and aware. The eyes weren't lit like animal eyes get blown out by cheap flash. They were dark and steady. The mouth was a line. The head turned slightly as if someone out of frame had made a sound. The hand lowered the camera. The last frame was nothing but fog, thick as milk. My mouth was dry. Tom watched my face instead of the screen, the way medics do when they're deciding which wound is the one that matters. In the fog above us, something knocked again. 3 beats that made my sternum hum. Farther off, I thought I heard a fourth, faint and answering. For a second, all the layered noise of the forest braided into a single rope. Water, wind, those knocks looping back and forth deeper in the trees. I tried to separate coincidence from message and failed. What I could do was what I've always done. Gather what the land offered and test it against what I knew. Bones crushed by pressure, not bitten. A cache of human things arranged, not hoarded. A warning carved in a language meant for me to read, backed by marks that weren't. A memory card rescued from rain, brought to a place where a human would find it if they were the kind of human who looked. We packed nothing but GPS coordinates and the card. We marked the site for law enforcement, flagged the route out with biodegradable tape no one else would notice unless they were already on the line. The collar pinged again, our elk drifting uphill like a ghost we couldn't catch. Fog thickened as if the ridge breathed out. The smell in it had a faint sting that bit the back of my nose, sour, metallic, small enough to ignore if you wanted a simpler story. On the way out, the forest kept close, Douglas fir trunks like pillars, salal brushing my knees. I almost missed the first carved trunk because it wasn't angled to face the trail. You had to step off the duff, circle the tree, commit to being where no one had invited you. The letters were deeper here. Fresh shavings curled at the base like cinnamon sticks. Stay away again. The A's slashed hard, the lines confident. And there, just behind the message, nested into the grain, those other signs again. The repeating arcs, the crosshatches, the quiet little runs of dots in 3s. I pressed my palm flat against the bark without thinking. The tree was cold, but I swear I felt a thrum under it. The kind you feel when a freight train passes a mile away and the ground decides to say so. I wanted to take a rubbing to photograph every inch, to turn data into armor against what I didn't want to believe. I didn't. I let the letters sit inside me the way the knocks had. On the tablet screen, the last frame still waited, fog and nothing. The forest is full of blanks like that, not silence. Something held back. We stepped away from the trunk back onto the barely trail, and the fog swallowed the carved face like a curtain closing too slowly to be a comfort. Somewhere behind us, wood tapped wood, 3 measured beats, and I knew we hadn't been told everything. I also knew the conversation had started without us a long time ago, and we were only now hearing the part meant for human ears. The card woke up like a small animal in my hand, warm from the tablet's port. A little heartbeat of data ticking through tiny brass teeth. Thumbnails lined up along the edge of the screen, mud brown, fern green, fog white. At first glance, they were the usual wilderness mess. Then the pattern snapped into focus. Pairs, a lost thing and the mark near it. A whistle on a string set on a mossed rock next to a clean oval track pressed into duff. A torn patch of nylon laid flat like a flag beside a cluster of 3 gouges on a cedar, each gouge the width of a finger. A dented fuel can cap on a stump, and above it on the same stump, a shallow arc carved into the grain. Then a second arc crossing it, like someone correcting a letter a child got almost right. Object, sign, object, sign. Someone, something, had been making a ledger the forest could read. I scrolled and scrolled the way you do when the story pulls you by the throat. The camera had stayed low after that initial fall, lens just off the ground, tilted a little, which gave the forest a horizon it doesn't usually have. Hands entered and left the frames, the big hand shaggy at the wrist with that pale fiber band I couldn't stop thinking about. A smaller hand once, narrow and human, the nails bitten to the quick. Sometimes the hand lifted a dropped thing and set it carefully on higher ground. away from standing water or the edge of a washout. Sometimes it angled the thing toward a particular direction, like an arrow made of what a person would want back. And always, just in the background, a tree trunk with letters cut deep. The same message repeating, the same quiet threat that wasn't a threat if you let yourself accept it as a boundary instead of a dare. The letters faced different ways. The marks behind them changed like regional dialects. But the intent never shifted. Keep out, keep away. Don't go where the ground breaks and the water burns. I could hear Tom's breathing over my shoulder. Calm. Even. The kind of breath you'd learn in war zones and ambulance backs. He didn't tell me what I was seeing. He let me find it alone, which is a kind of care. The next set of images looked like a detour. Night frames. A smear of white rain in a headlamp beam. A hard, reflective glint that stung the edge of the sensor like a star. I pinched and zoomed, not animal eyes, a stake. One of those skinny fiberglass rods miners and surveyors use, half buried, topped with tape that flutters like a moth. Farther back, a second glint, the curved visor of a headlamp where it had dropped and come to rest angle up in a pocket of ferns. The human hand again, fingers chalky with dust, reached for it and set it upright on a rock. The beam hit the carved trunk full on, washed the letters white. Stay away, bright as if it had just been written, fresh curls of wood still at its feet. And then the hand lowered, and in the slope behind the tree a darker line bit across the ground, straight and not natural. Hose or cable. The camera didn't know where to focus, but my gut did. That line ran down toward the creek. We hustled back to the site with the kind of urgency that tries to look like routine. Afternoon it slid into that washed-out gray the peninsula wears before night. The air moved a little. The fog lifted enough to suggest shapes and then close its fist again. I carried a pack full of cameras and straps and IR flashes and zip ties, the little plastic answers you give a forest that will never be impressed by them. I set traps in a ring around the carved trunk like a crown, each one tilted to catch a different approach. Knee height, shoulder height, a low one along a game trail where I'd seen fresh deer slots. I angled one down to catch hands. I angled one up to catch faces. Tom watched the tree line while I worked, and when the wind shifted, he closed his eyes and turned like a man letting a song find him. "You smell that?" he asked without asking me to agree. I pulled back the mask of damp and green and let other notes through. It found me high in the nose first. Sour, metallic, not rot, not sulfur. The closest memory I had was a high school chemistry lab after someone cracked a bottle they shouldn't have. Windows thrown open, teacher smiling too much to hide how fast her heart was beating. Ammonia, I thought. Or some cousin. It rode the air in thin threads. Enough to ignore if you wanted to. Enough to follow if you'd already decided to stop lying to yourself. We moved downstream without stepping on the slick same stones twice. The creek ran quick and cold, rind of foam collecting eddies like lace. In crosslight, I saw a sheen smear in the backwater. Rainbows that shouldn't be there unless someone's truck had rolled a little too close for comfort. I dipped a finger in and rubbed it in the pad of my thumb. It stung. Not the sharp burn of acid, the flat kind that steals oxygen from water and stories from the mouths of people who come after. Tom marked the smell and the sheen and the direction the line must run with a series of little gestures. There and keep your eyes soft. And we turned back to the tree before we made ourselves targets for a camera that wouldn't have moss or bark anywhere near it. On the hike out, the forest did that trick where it crouches closer as the light dies. We kept our lamps dark. The fog built from the ground up, a ghost with patience. I felt watched but not hunted, which is a distinction you learn out here if you last. At the truck, I touched my phone like a talisman, even though I'd set every unit to push pings to the tablet. The first test shots had already come in. Bark and crisp IR. A mouse launching itself into flight with all four legs at once. A thrush like a small puff of smoke until the sensor made it into an angel with wings of static. I didn't need sleep, not anymore. We made camp close enough to the service road that a ranger wouldn't hassle us and far enough down an overgrown spur that anyone expecting company would be disappointed. The night sounds stacked. Owls running commentary, branches ticking in a rhythm that didn't match the knocks from earlier. The creek a steady ribbon under it all. Tom boiled water on a small stove and handed me a mug that steamed against my face like a promise. He didn't ask me about the headlamp in the photo. He didn't ask me about the stakes. He didn't have to. We both had the same map in our heads. It had more straight lines on it than a place like this should ever allow. Sometime after midnight, the tablet chirped. Not loud. Enough. The little red badge bloomed. A new image. I opened it and felt my heart tumble against my ribs like it wanted out. The first frame was nothing but hair, dark and coarse, filling the IR with a white halo around each fiber. Then a plane of palm. Lines and skin like river deltas. The heel of a hand pressed soft against the lens the way you cup a moth to carry it outside. The next image rolled in a second later. The same hand now holding the mount itself. The camera's horizon tilted. Bark slid by. Ferns became swords. The sensor hunted, found, lost, found again. The hand wasn't smacking or tearing. It was careful, deliberate. The angle changed one more time and locked. The frame now took in a corridor of understory I hadn't noticed on the way in. Two fallen trees leaned against each other just right, making a doorway of moss and shadow. The ground beyond was scuffed, not by boots, not by hooves, by weight carried low and wide. The carved trunk was no longer centered. It sat to the side of the picture like a signpost you've already read and obeyed. My camera was now looking where I should go if I wanted to understand the rest. We waited, ridiculous as that sounds after a day like that, eyes flicking from the tablet to the open mouth of the dark. Another chirp, another frame. The corridor again, a little closer this time as if the lens had breathed in. Something pale at ground level glowed where IR catches skin. Not human pale, not animal pale either. Fibers braided, looped over a low branch like a bracelet set down while you work. I zoomed until the pixels got ugly and still knew what it was. Bark cordage, the same twist I'd seen on that wrist in the Fallen camera series. A little gift, a little dare. I felt my own pulse in my fingers. Tom's voice came low and steady, the kind you use on a cliff edge. "She's showing you where the line is," he said, "and where it isn't." The last image hit like a breath on my ear, the hand again, closer. A fingertip tapped the side of the housing once, twice, 3 times, not a punch, a knock. Then the frame held still so long my eyes watered. The forest breathed. Somewhere far off, wood answered wood in those same 3 beats. And then nothing more came, as if whatever had done the moving had melted into what it had always been. The camera stared into the doorway it had been turned to face. I stared with it, and the night pressed softly against my back like a door closing with someone very large on the other side. I didn't plan on screaming. I planned on getting a clean thumbnail. Mount Hood in a cold blue frame. Breath visible. Me on the edge of a mossy cut bank like every other survival channel you've ever hate-watched at 2 a.m. But the rock I trusted rolled under my heel like a bad joke, and the creek below rose up faster than the camera could fall. Later I'd learned that my scream punched through somebody's rescue net and ripped across a radio miles away. In the moment it was just me. Air, and that heart-stopping second you realize you're not braced for what's coming. I hit the water sideways, shin cracking the lip of a boulder before the rest of me slapped down. Cold blew through me like a fuse. I heard a pop that felt too intimate to belong to anyone else's body and knew instantly it wasn't the good kind. Instinct tried to stand me up. Pain put me back. I don't mind admitting it. There are levels of hurt your jaw can't disguise. It's one thing to talk tough into a lens. It's another to pull your leg out of a winter creek and see your boot at an angle your brain doesn't have a word for. I knew feet. I knew inches. I didn't have a measure for that angle. For a while, the world narrowed to details. The way the fog snagged on alder catkins like wool. The way my GoPro bobbed in the eddy, its little red light insisting it was still a witness. My hands were numb by the time I found a branch to haul with. I got my back against a log at the undercut bank and dragged. Every inch bought me another little hammer in the side of my leg. Fibula, I thought in some ridiculous corner of my head. I didn't know the word because of school. I knew it because I'd broken it once coming off a skateboard at 16 and remembered the hollow rasp of bone ends speaking to each other when they shouldn't. This was that, plus water, plus the grind of pebbles inside my sock like someone had salted me with gravel. I did the dumb math you do where you divide miles by pride. The trailhead was 2 miles back, maybe 3 the way I'd meandered. The light had a late afternoon tilt. November doesn't negotiate on daylight out here. I had a mylar blanket, a cheap bivvy, a lighter that liked to pretend it was empty and then surprise me. I had a first aid kit where gauze went to die. I had a knife I'd talked about on camera like it would solve loneliness. I also had right then the feeling you get when eyes settle on you from an angle you can't name. The bear came in quiet. Black, not massive the way movies pretend, but enough, more than enough at my height on the ground. She smelled like wet dog and fallen apples, and she didn't snarl. She just existed, filling the negative space at the edge of my vision until she was all the space. I didn't run. I couldn't, but also I knew not to. I talked. You don't think about your voice until you hear it try to be gentle and not shake. Hey girl, easy, not your business. Look at me being big. Look at my hands. Look how I'm taking up space with this foil blanket that doesn't want to unfold. She did that side-to-side head bob bears do when they're deciding. I could see the pads of her feet press little half moons into the silt. There was something sweet on her breath under the musk. A memory of somebody's trash can where pears had liquefied and turned into candy. She huffed once, and then the air changed. It didn't flip. It didn't crack. It deepened, like a drum got added to the song the forest was already playing. A shape stepped out where shadows had been a second earlier and gathered all the light to itself until the edges of it were soft and wrong. I want to say height, but height is a number and numbers fell apart in that second. What I remember is proportion, the shoulders that made the alder behind them look young. The arm that came down like a crane, the hand that was a thought and then a presence bigger than the bear's head. There was a sound that lived in 2 worlds at once, a noise I felt more than heard. It had a growl's low center, but there were other notes braided in. Human vowel sounds rubbed down to music, a warning I could almost read. The bear made the decision I wanted her to make. She backed up without the panicked clatter of something chased. She swung her big head to keep both of us in view and melted back into fog so casually I felt stupid for just then noticing how fog can give you a door and take it back. I remember a palm, the heel of it close to my face, as big as a dinner plate, smelling like smoke that isn't from the kind of fire you buy at a store. The hand didn't touch me. It hovered, checking my shape the way a medic does when the blood hasn't yet told you what it's going to do. I was busy trying to keep the edges of the world tied to the middle. Cold will take everything if you let it. I let it take my last little bit of pride when I said, out loud, please. The next minutes broke into small, perfect pieces and slid past like leaves in a back eddy. A fire kindled faster than an angry idea. On dry days, I've cursed damp wood enough to know what it takes to lift a flame in the Northwest. Whoever did this had homeschooled friction. A knife I didn't understand split punky cedar into hair. A businesslike breath coaxed it from ember to life. The light it made was gold, the kind that sits near the ground and pretends to be tame. Someone's hands, hers, I know now, though my brain argued the point from a place that still wanted the world simple. Went to my boot. The laces sighed, the tongue lifted slow like a bandage stuck to skin. The cool air on my sock hurt worse than heat. Leaves I knew and didn't know got crushed between fingers, and the smell that came off them was bright and bitter, like a field dressing and a meadow had a child. A strip of something pale and strong cinched around my lower leg, above the place where every beat of my heart had started to feel like a hammer. The strip didn't bite, it held. The way it crossed itself wasn't a knot I'd seen in any scout manual. It was a pattern you'd learn if your days were full of branches and your nights were full of rain. Light and shadow did a slow dance in the cave I didn't realize we'd made until I smelled rock and damp earth close to my mouth. Not a cave exactly. A room where boulders leaned together, the ceiling low enough for you to feel watched by stone, the floor patched with dry duff someone had scraped together by the handful. That sense you get when you're somewhere someone has been on purpose, not by accident. Everything chosen, everything explained by need. The fire said small things. My legs sang louder ones, then quieter, and I let the ugly buzz in my head dim. The big shape moved at the edge of what the flames could name and then stepped through. I saw hair that wasn't fur, not like a dog's, not an even length or tidy direction. More like water had learned to be hair and never got the same answer twice. I saw a face that refused to be the cartoon the internet had taught me to expect. The mouth was a line. The brow was heavy but not stupid. The eyes were the most human thing in the room, and they looked at my leg and then at me as if asking permission to continue what she'd already started. I nodded because language felt ridiculous between us, and because survival had boiled every decision down to yes or no. And I wasn't dumb. She worked without fuss. The fiber she used came from bark I'd walked past 1,000 times without understanding it could be cord. She twined it with a thumb and forefinger that moved faster than thought and gentler than mercy. She tucked fern and something with a waxier leaf under the wrap. And when her fingers brushed my skin, it was just touch, not fear. Warmth came off her like a wall, off her. Sleep doesn't always feel like sleep when you're fighting it. Sometimes it's just a lap dissolve, bright fading to dark at the edges while the center keeps pretending it's got this. I drifted along the edge and tried to stay because curiosity is as strong a tether as blood. Somewhere outside, or inside the rock, a knock answered another knock. 3 beats answered by 3 in a pattern that had nothing to do with wind. My mind wanted to assign it to luck. My body wanted to call it law. I came back hard like a swimmer breaking the surface, a gulp and a choke and the panic of not remembering where air lives. The fire had gone to coals. Light puddled instead of shining. The ache in my leg had stepped down a rung or two on the ladder, but it was still there waiting. The room felt smaller, or maybe my fear did. I turned my head and she was there, closer than before, her shoulder filling the world, her hands busy at my shin. Bark fiber crossed and crossed again, a lattice that made sense even to a brain that wasn't ready to trust. She tied nothing. She wove. The leaves under the weave smelled like an answer I could breathe. She looked up at me, not past me, at me. There was soot along the ridge of her cheekbone like old war paint. Her eyes didn't flick away when I met them. They held me the way the wrap held my leg, firm, unafraid, not asking for anything back. Somewhere outside, water kept telling its same ancient story like nothing had happened. Somewhere in the pocket of rock beside us, a tiny curl of smoke wrote soft shapes above the coals. I knew the bear was gone. I knew I wasn't alone. I knew with the clarity pain sometimes gives that whatever I'd come out here to catch on camera wasn't interested in being caught and had saved me anyway. I opened my mouth to say thank you to a creature I wasn't ready to name. She set one big finger gently against her own lips. A gesture as old as any language. and I shut mine so the room could keep its secret a little longer. I woke to light the color of tin and the hush a forest makes after talking all night. My leg was held in a lattice of bark fiber tighter and smarter than anything I could have tied, swelling kept honest by the weave. The coals were breathing, small orange eyes under ash. She was there, broad shoulder, smoke in the long hair, the same steady eyes, and beside her another figure that moved like the woods knew his steps. He was narrower at the waist, arms long, hands scarred. If she was gravity, he was line. He carried a length of straight sapling and a sharpened sliver of stone bound into a handle with twists of pale cord. I didn't need an introduction to understand what he was to her. He was the one who writes on wood. He looked at me once, not unkind, as if measuring what could be asked of a man who couldn't put weight on his own foot. Then he knelt by the mouth of the cave and laid the sapling across his knees. The only sound was the creek working its way through boulders and the quiet pop of resin somewhere inside the coals. He raised his right hand and touched 3 fingers to his sternum, then to his mouth, then out toward the world. It was simple. It was church and field dressing and family table all at once. He opened his palm and let it hover over the coals. Ash dusted his skin. He drew a line on his own forehead with that ash and then held my gaze until I felt like I'd been caught skipping a step in a ceremony everyone else already knew. Behind him, from deeper shade, she brought forward a haunch wrapped in leaves and twined shut with the same bark rope that held my bones in their lane. Meat has a smell you can't fake, clean and dark and undeniable. They had taken what they needed in the night and left a field that didn't look like a war. He lifted a pinch of ash, set it gently on the slick curve of the haunch as if pressing a thought into it, then touched the ash to his forehead again. He shaped his big hands into the curve of a jaw, then mimed a bite, then laid those hands flat like pages. Predator eats to live, I heard without hearing. We eat to remember. It wasn't words. It was the kind of sentence your body understands before your head translates. He offered me a smear of ash on the tip of his finger. I reached. He didn't blink when I touched my own brow. It was serious and not dramatic. It finished something that had already started when she hauled me out of the creek. They wasted nothing. The leaves that came off the bundle became plates. The sinew that would have gone to coyotes got cut clean and set aside with purposeful movements I recognized from kitchens and aid stations. Even the bones had a future, set not in trash piles but in a lattice on a flat rock near the cave mouth, as if drying in a pattern that would mean something later. The air in that little room took the smell of meat and turned it into a message about gratitude. I kept my mouth shut because it felt like the only payment I could make that wouldn't offend. When we finished, he wiped his fingers on the pale bark rope at his wrist and picked up a short stick burned black on one end. He tapped it twice against the sapling in his lap. Soft, quick pulses that barely rose above the creek. Then a single longer tap, firm enough I felt it in my chest. 2 short, 1 long. He held up his hand and waited. Somewhere uphill, wood answered wood in the same pattern, dampened by distance. He tapped again. 3 even knocks, spaced like a steady heartbeat. The answer that came was 3 in return, nearer, almost playful against the skin of a dead cedar. Safe, not safe. It was as simple as train signals and as old as any drum. He put the stick in my hand, turned my wrist with a touch that said he'd done this with children and strangers and maybe enemies too, and angled the end of the sapling under my palm like a drumstick. I tried the 3. I was clumsy. He shook his head, no shame in it, closed his huge fingers over my smaller ones and adjusted the angle until the sound carried right. He gave me 2 short, 1 long. I felt foolish and then I felt seen, and the difference between those is wider than any canyon we crossed to get out there. In the pause between sets, I heard a different sound, one that didn't belong to trees or birds. A little shiver at the edge of hearing. A hum that didn't come from anything living. He heard it too. So did she. Her head tilted toward the creek and the line of her shoulders changed in that way bodies do when the past shows up wearing today's coat. He stood. She stood. I tried to stand and made it to a lean sweat bright on my temples even in November air. He made a motion with 2 fingers, a quick sketch in the air that said stay without the insult of treating me like a child. He slipped out of the cave. She went with him to the doorway and then looked back at me and touched her palm to her chest. I answered the same because I didn't have a better language yet. Time did that elastic thing it does when you're on the edge of pain and on the edge of finding out something that will change the map in your head. A jay heckled the world from a hemlock. A coil of smoke ragdolled and disappeared into wet stone. I tried the taps on my own where they couldn't see me, practicing the way you practice names you don't want to mispronounce when it matters. When they returned, he had cedar dust ribboning from the edge of his blade and a new energy in his step. He set the sapling upright and eyed the grain like a carpenter picking where a beam should live. Then he took the stone and began to write the way he writes. I've watched men carve. There's a kind that leans on strength and a kind that leans on knowing how wood wants to be itself. He was the second kind. The letters rose under his hand, not because he forced them, but because he asked the sapling to admit what it already held. The cuts ran deep and clean. The curls fell in sweet-smelling piles at his knees. "Stay away," the line said. The A's slashed like a warning flag. Behind the English, out of reflex or habit, his wrist made other marks in the raw wood. Nested arcs, crosshatches, little runs of 3. He set the base of the pole with a round of strikes that went straight to ground. He lifted the post and walked with it not toward the trail I'd taken in like a tourist, but along a seam of undergrowth that opened for him and would have closed on me. She moved with him, the 2 of them quiet except for breath, and the soft hoot she used the way people use a hay when they're sliding a heavy thing together. They set the pole where the country changes mood. I could feel it even from the cave. The shade got sourer, the water sound tightened, and the air picked up that sharp, sympathetic note I'd clocked with Tom days back but couldn't place. I wanted to tell myself it was just the creek falling over a new lip of rock. Then the wind shifted and the smell hit clean. The ammonia sting. The metallic ghost that rides on the back of cheap fuel. The straight line in a place that hates straight lines. From my angle, I could see only slivers of what lay beyond, but it was enough. A blue tarp sagging under a costume of moss. A tangle of hose disguised with a few thoughtful ferns draped over it like a bad toupee. A scatter of bent stakes that hadn't come from a ranger's hand. Plastic buckets turned into a wall. Everything just out of sight from where a hiker would point a camera, but unavoidable if you were the kind of person who followed water to its source. The hum I'd heard earlier had a place to live now. A pump somewhere in the brush drilled its sound into the bank and made the creek wear that noise like a leash. He drove the post until it held. He looked at his work the way you do when you straighten a picture and step back to make sure it tells the truth. She stood a little off, watching him the way people watch someone they rely on not to miss the details. Then they both turned slow and in sync and looked not at the tarp or the hose but past them, toward a slope where the earth showed scars under a new, too even blanket of leaf litter. I saw it then the way you see tracks after someone points at the right patch and your brain stops insisting on innocence. The ground had been cut and pressed back. Rocks that should have been random had the telltale stagger that comes from shovels. A runnel had been forced to go somewhere it didn't choose. Everything about it wanted to pretend it was just forest. Everything about it told a different story if you let yourself read. He raised the burned stick and tapped the new post with 3 even beats. The sound carried true. It wasn't a performance. It was a message sent to whatever ears would catch it. The elk nosing down into the draw. The night hunter rolling a shoulder against a trunk. The human who'd pretend he didn't hear it and come anyway. Then he set the stick down, pressed his palm to the word he'd carved like a benediction, and let his hand slide to the marks behind the English. The ones that weren't mine to pronounce. She came back to me first. On her way, she paused at a stump, lifted a headlamp I recognized not as mine but as one of ours, the generic rubber-banded kind sold by the dozen, and set it gently on top. Lens pointed up toward the new warning as if to teach any human passing how to read. When she ducked into the cave, her hair brushed the lintel and dusted my shoulder with cedar smell. She touched the wrap on my leg, checked the color under my toenail with a press like a nurse. Her mouth made the shape of a word I almost heard and then didn't. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice. A vow lived in the way she went quiet when our eyes met. Out at the post, he was still. The forest was not. Something moved in the cover beyond the tarp. The quick flicker that belongs to men who don't think the woods are watching. A cough that pretended to be a truck clearing its throat farther down the spur. The pump's hum hiccuped and steadied. He didn't look back at me. He angled the carved word just a hair so it faced not the trail, not the cave, but that bad geometry by the water. He raised the stick and gave 2 short taps and one long, clean, and unmistakable. The answer came from deeper in the trees, the same pattern snapping back like a thrown ball caught by a strong hand. I counted the beats with my pulse, felt the message land where it needed to, and knew whatever was about to happen would not be solved by a camera or a clever caption. He set his palm on the wood one more time, turned his head as if listening to a voice I couldn't hear, and the fog stepped between us like a curtain that knows exactly when to fall. We turned a ranger garage into a field lab because that's what the day demanded. Fluorescence hummed above a concrete floor scarred by chains and snow tires, and a long folding table wore a clean blue tarp like a doctor's gown. The bones lay in a careful order: radius, pelvis, 2 metatarsals, skull fragment with that ugly zigzag, and every part of me that wanted to rush had to sit down and breathe. I brought the kit I keep for collars and camera traps, plus the little extras I tell procurement are educational. A hand lens, a USB scope, a blacklight that makes lichens glow like graffiti. Ranger May Whitaker leaned in with that regulatory patience you can't fake. She's been on this forest long enough to have names for trees most people pass without a glance, and scars from arguments that never made the paper. Tom stood in the doorway, hands on a thermos, bringing the cold air in with him and letting it mingle with coffee and bleach. Under the scope, bone is landscape. It isn't smooth. It's a desert of ridges and holes, and the way those holes break tells you who was here. Bears leave wide grooves where molars crushed and slid, polished like river stones. Cats puncture in pairs, conical, edges clean as surgical steel. What I was staring at didn't read as teeth. The cortex had turned to chalk along hairline seams that ran like lightning, radiating from nothing my eye wanted to name. In some places, the inner surface had flaked in plates like paint when a house goes too long between winters. Tiny spalls lifted and hung, micro cracks webbed, not from twisting but from a hand pressing down on the whole world at once. Compressive force, sudden, indifferent. I said what I saw out loud, because sometimes the sound of your own voice is the only thing that keeps the room from bending. Not bites, not claw marks. Pressure that came from far more than any animal brings to a fight. May nodded once. No triumph, just the small satisfaction of fitting a puzzle piece, and laid a map sleeve on the table. A USGS sheet with the slope we'd been on a few days earlier lit up in pencil and highlighter. "Look here," she said, tapping a swath that ran like a bruise along the contour lines. Debris flow corridor, old slides after heavy rain, and look at the microquake clusters from the last few years. Red dots sprinkled across the blue like freckles. Nighttime spikes, she added. We get complaints. Gunshots after midnight. Pops. Thumps. By the time I get a deputy up there, the fog's back and the road's a rumor. Tom set his thermos down and rubbed 2 fingers together like he was remembering grit. That smell wasn't in my head, he said, more to himself than to us. Ammonia, the metallic ghost of cheap fuel. He doesn't waste words. When he offers one, you put it where it belongs. I pulled up the SD card catalog on my tablet and blinked away the garage lights so the screen could translate what the forest had given us. We'd been through a lot of it already. The pairs, the objects, and the marks. A language born of placement and patience. There was one frame at the end I'd flagged and left alone because grief likes to hide in pixels and I didn't trust my hands not to shake. It was dark. Almost nothing there. A smear of motion, a flare that might be a raindrop on the lens. Today I let myself touch the sliders. Exposure up, shadows lifted. Blacks pulled just enough to admit a shape without lying. Noise crawled out like ants. And then a picture stepped forward. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't even a shadow you could call a trick. It was a person. A human torso in a dark jacket with reflective piping, a hard hat in one hand, the other hand hooked around the valve of a cylinder strapped to his back. The kind welders carry, the kind divers wear. A regulator disc sat against his shoulder, hose arcing down into a tangle of brush that, now that we weren't pretending, looked a lot like a disguised pump line. His headlamp had slid sideways on the band and threw a cone of light across a tarp rigged too low to be a shelter. His glove had a tear at the thumb. He was looking down, not up, not at any camera, not at any animal, at a cable that ran into a crack in the slope too clean to be nature. My throat closed the way it did when the sheriff called me in 2019. I wasn't looking at a creature that made people disappear. I was looking at a man who had brought something into a place that knows how to bury its own mistakes. The bones on the table weren't chewed, they were crushed. Rockfall doesn't need a motive. A detonation cap doesn't know whose calendar it cuts in half. May let out a breath the garage seemed to have been holding with us. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't say anything at all for a long 20 seconds. Then she reached for the radio clipped to her shoulder out of habit and didn't key it. "If this was a legal blast," she said finally, voice level, "I would have signed the permit. There isn't one. Which means somebody set off charges on federal land after midnight, probably more than once, and probably figured the ground would take the blame." She slid a printed log out from under the map. Noise complaints, calls without names, dates, and times lined up like fence posts. A lot of 2:13 a.m., a lot of 3:07. Always when fog eats sound and throws it back in pieces. Tom didn't look at the table. He looked at the door like he was measuring the distance to the creek even from here. "Show her where the water turns wrong," he said. Not as an order, but as a direction our day had to go. We didn't need all of us for that. He went. May stayed. I stayed and kept translating. He stayed and it kept getting worse with light. Back 2 frames, the same spot, same tarp, but the angle hinted at other hands. A stack of fiberglass stakes with the flags pulled off and stuffed in a pocket. A coil of wire with clay caps tucked like candy into a glove. The last frame from that series, the one after the man with the cylinder, held a fraction of a face in the edge of the beam, beard gone wet with mist, the side of a mouth tight with concentration or impatience. I couldn't tell. What I could tell was the band of reflective tape across his chest had 3 dashes in a pattern I'd seen on a private security jacket last winter. It wasn't a useful clue by itself. It was a story trying to introduce itself. The bones on the table stopped being a mystery and turned into a message. The arrangement in the rock cave. the way the camera had been lifted and turned to face a doorway. The letters carved for us, backed by the marks that weren't. None of it was random. I had gone into those images expecting an animal's den. What I had was a filing system, a museum in moss and cedar curated by hands that chose what ought to be seen and by whom. The tribe the old stories called wild wasn't hiding a crime. They were holding the evidence in the only court that had ever treated them fairly. Time and pattern and a tree that remembers what you cut into it. Tom's call came in low on May's radio before he put words to it. You can hear creak in a voice if you know what to parse. Discoloration in the pool below the second bend, he said. Sheen. The sting we talked about. Plastics in the brush. Tarp. Somebody trying to look like nobody. May scribbled a grid reference before the GPS had a chance to be helpful, and I pinged a breadcrumb on the map where the slides and the microquakes kissed the creek like a bad promise. I told myself to wait for the lab, for the kind of analysis that prints out numbers and lets you hide behind them. I also knew what we already had, microfractures that don't belong to teeth. A person with a cylinder standing where no permit had ever allowed one to stand. Objects placed and angled not to hoard but to direct. You don't have to be a statistician to understand weight when it sits down on your chest and refuses to budge. May's jaw had that set I've seen on people who have had to tell families what comes next. I'm filing an incident, she said, the kind that gets ignored until it can't be. She looked at the bones and then at me. We're not putting any of this other part in writing. Not yet. The other part meant the hands in the photos, the braids of bark, the eyes that had looked down a camera and decided it could be taught. My tablet pinged from the corner like a kid tugging a sleeve. One of the traps we'd set around the carved trunk pushed a live shot into our morning. The three of us bent in at once, foreheads almost touching. The first frame was wind, cedar fronds blown white by IR. The second was a blur like fur too close to focus. The third got my heart to stutter. Not fur, skin. A human hand wrapped in a cheap work glove with a hole over the knuckle, veins raised in the cold, fingers dug under a cut in the bark. The glove bunched as the hand pulled. The post we'd watched get written into the world rocked in the frame. The letters flashed white, splinters lifted and broke. On the edge of the image, something like a tattoo curved along a wrist bone. Maybe a snake, maybe barbed wire, the kind a man gets when he's 20 and doesn't have anyone to tell him it won't age well. Another frame. The post lurched harder. The glove found purchase lower, gripped and yanked. The carved word tipped out of the earth like a tooth ripped without anesthetic. Behind the hand, just a sliver. The corner of a tarp I recognized from the dark frames and a line of hose dressed with ferns. The angle of the camera caught a face only as a ghost. Beard, the slash of reflective tape, the flattened glow of a headlamp aimed down. It was enough. Enough to know the warning wasn't just ignored. It was being erased. At the edge of the garage, something knocked. Not loud. 3 even beats that I felt more than heard in the bones of my face and the bones on the table and the bones in the ground that had carried all of us to this exact second. Then, faint but sure from somewhere I couldn't name, 3 answering beats came back, thin as a breath through a closed door. We stood in a room full of proof we could to take to court and a message we couldn't translate into paperwork, and the screen in my hand kept showing the same glove on the same post in a forest that had run out of patience with straight lines. They hit the airwaves first. By noon, local feeds were full of shaky cell phone clips from a campground near Zigzag. Picnic tables toppled, a cooler torn open, claw marks up the side of a bathroom door like someone had raked 5 knives at shoulder height. A man in a camo cap stood in front of a van with KPNW painted on the side and told a reporter he'd heard growls. Like a freight train and a scream had a baby. The camera cut to a close-up of the gouges and I wanted to reach through the screen and measure them. Evenly spaced, Parallel. Too clean. A bear's swipe wanders. A cat's claws don't leave the same depth route to tip. This was a ruler in a story trying to get married on live TV. In the ranger garage, we'd turned into a lab. The fluorescence hummed like a warning. May was on the phone doing her tightrope walk. Calm voice, hard facts, no promises. Tom leaned against the doorframe, looking out to where a thin rain was starting, the kind that has more to say after dark. The tablet on the table carried the latest frames from our traps up at the carved trunk. The post I'd watched get set with careful hands was now ripped out and lying at an angle. Letters splintered, the base packed with fresh mud that still looked wet in IR. A glove flashed in one frame, cheap, gray, the thumb blown out. A strip of reflective tape slashed the edge of another. Every few seconds, a burst of white noise crackled from a scanner app I'd left open on my phone out of habit more than hope. It was the voice that made me look up. Male, Oregon flat, the kind you hear at hardware stores and high school gyms. Not afraid, irritated. "Copy that," he said, clipped and bored, like this was a job, not a secret. "Yeah, tear it up, dump it on Bigfoot. The public will buy it." Someone snickered. Someone else added, "Leave some hair this time." Then a pop of side tone and silence. Tom's eyes found mine. May's hand tightened on the radio without lifting it. I told myself I was hearing what I wanted to hear. Then the same voice came back, a little staticky and closer to whatever fence I keep around my temper. "Get the cameras up by the turnout," he said. "Make it obvious. We need the story to land before somebody starts asking about pumps." By late afternoon, the vans had moved deeper, past the day-use lots and into the kind of dirt pullouts where people with secrets park. A blogger in a neon beanie did a piece to camera about primal carnage with a ridge of Mount Hood behind him blurred just enough to feel like a set. Their clip rolled in my feed with a thumbnail of the bathroom door and music like a heartbeat. I felt sick and furious in one breath. It's easy to pick a monster when the real thing has a receipt. I drafted a press email that pulled as much weight as I could make it carry. Micro fractures in the bone, evidence of compressive force, nighttime blasts where no permit ever lived. A photo, lightened, of a man with a cylinder on his back and a hose disappearing under a tarp where water runs wrong. I attached a briefing for the state geologist I knew from a conference back when my life had lab coats and belts for pipettes. I put Tom's name on the CC line for a rescue chief who still took his calls, and then I hovered over send like it was a detonator because my phone buzzed against my wrist. Unknown number, Hood River area code. "Elena?" A voice I recognized from the cave even though I'd never heard him speak there. Younger than mine, carrying pain like a backpack he couldn't put down. "It's Caleb." I turned my back to the room and stepped into the hall. Rain whispered on the concrete apron outside, steady as a respirator. "You're okay," I said because I needed to say it out loud to make it hold. "I'm alive," he said, which was not the same thing and exactly the same thing. "They found me this morning." He didn't say how he'd gotten to a place where finding made sense. He didn't have to. "Listen, I saw your story, the bathroom door, the news." His breath hitched once, shallow, the way pain steals air. "Don't put out the other stuff, not yet." "Hey, Caleb, we have to stop them," I said. "If we wait, they'll bury it. They'll bury us. They'll follow it," he said, not loud, urgency wrapped in a whisper. "If you make noise about pumps and tarps, they'll comb the area you care about. They'll bring more, dogs, drones. They'll find the cave." The word landed like a hand on a bruise. He swallowed. "They carried me out. They left me where I say our team could find me without seeing anything they weren't supposed to. Don't pay them back by putting a spotlight on their front door." Front door. The phrase slid through me and hung there. "Where are you?" I asked. "St. Vincent," he said. "Portland, Splint, I fool, a nurse who misses her grandmother's gumbo." A small laugh that hurt. I'll keep quiet about all of it. You have my word. But you can't show them what you think will save the forest if it draws them to the wrong place. He paused. You know I'm right. Oh, I didn't trust my voice. I let the rain answer while I dragged the slider on my temper down to a level that wouldn't wreck the day. Okay, I said finally. Okay. When I stepped back into the garage, the email draft still glared up at me like a lit fuse. I closed it. I saved the attachment somewhere quieter than my outbox. Tom had set his thermos aside and was at the far end of the table staring at nothing. People who've held choking tricks, who've taken pulses in rooms that got loud and then too quiet, they get a look when the past reaches under the present and yanks. I made a call once, he said without me asking. House fire in Forks, 2 trapped, one you could hear, one you couldn't. The one you hear messes with your head. You go to the voice. You convince yourself you can pull off both. He rubbed his thumb along a scar on his forearm like he was reading a story written under the skin. The floor went. I went with it until a beam stopped me. My partner didn't. I keep playing it like a bad song in my head. If I'd gone quiet first, maybe both come home. He did the half smile you make when your own story disgusts you. I don't want to choose wrong again because somebody standing close and loud says, look over here. I looked at the bones, at the map with red dots where the ground hiccuped after midnight, at a frame on my tablet where a glove was winning against a word that asked nothing but distance. What's right? I said mostly to myself. Maybe the thing that doesn't feel good right now. May ended her call and stood for a second with both hands on the table like she needed the wood to speak straight to her bones. She slid a folded topo toward me, not the copy she'd file, a print she'd marked on the sly in pencil that smudged if you breathed on it. If I run this up my chain the way the book says, she said, I'll get 2 deputies, a voicemail, and a reminder that my pension depends on not courting headaches. If you go there before dawn, you'll get something else. She tapped the paper. Old logging spur, mile marker 41 1/4. There's a stash, caps, wire, cylinders. Somebody's been lazy because fog lets lazy men feel like geniuses. She looked me in the eye. You didn't get this from me. May, Tom started, an entire paragraph in his tone. She cut him off with a look that had weather patterns inside it. They've already made it a circus, she said. Crowds keep honest work from happening. I'm not sending uniforms up there to get filmed stepping on evidence while a man in a neon beanie tells the internet about murder apes. She pulled the radio off her shoulder and clicked it once, not transmitting, just grounding herself in the weight of it. You, she nodded at me. Go quiet. Bring back pictures I can use without getting laughed out of a courtroom. You, to Tom, keep her alive. Outside, the rain shifted to a steadier pour. The garage door rattled once in a gust and then settled like a sleeping thing. I packed light because we were going to move like a rumor. Cameras, extra cards, a kit built from the parts you pray you won't need. Tom checked batteries like they were oxygen tanks. May wrote a phone number on the corner of the topo and circled it. Burn that after you memorize it, she said, not smiling. We killed the lights and let the gray of late day define our edges. The forest has a way of coming closer when you go quiet. I could feel it at the edge of the lot beyond the slash of road and ditch. A patience that wasn't human watching us decide what kind of people we were. I threw a last glance at the email I hadn't sent, at the photo I wanted to shove down a newsroom's throat, at the bones that had stopped being a puzzle and started being a message. I slid the tablet into my pack. I slid a different version of myself over the one who loves a microphone when it'll help the right thing win. The first knock came from the tree line by the dumpsters. Clean, hollow. 3 beats in a row, a little closer together than usual, like footsteps speeding up. The second answered from the slope behind the garage where the sword ferns grow thick. 3 again, tighter. The third sounded behind us where the gravel meets the road, a set that made the metal roof hum. Tom's head came up. May's hand went to her belt without thinking. I didn't breathe. It wasn't a warning to stay away. It was a sentence I hadn't heard until that moment. Not safe, not later. Now. The pattern ran once more around us, a circle closing, and under it, faint and human from down the road, the small, ugly sputter of a truck that's been asked to carry more than it should, and the tattle of cheap radios stepping on each other as men laughed at their own lies. Night took the shape of fog and moved in like it owned the place. We left the Ranger garage with our lights blacked out and our plans scrawled on the inside of our lungs. Quiet in, quiet out. No hero speeches. May stayed on the radio from a mile down the highway, parked dark with her engine off, ready to call it in if we didn't come back. Tom drove with his hands at 10 and 2 like he could hold the whole forest steady. I rode shotgun with a pack that felt heavier than it should, counting heartbeats between the knocks I hoped I wouldn't hear. Caleb surprised me at the pullout by mile marker 41 1/4, propped on crutches with a hospital band still on his wrist and a face that said he'd made his choice hours ago and no nurse on earth could stop him. He had a headlamp he refused to turn on, a jacket 2 sizes too big, and the calm of somebody who'd already been to the worst room and walked out. The spur May marked was an old logging ribbon letting alders grow up through its bones. The truck wouldn't fit without announcing itself, so we parked and went on foot. The air had that winter wet, cold, clean, a little bite that made you want to breathe shallow. Fog from knee-high to crown-high. It swallowed the world in soft gray swallows. Under it, everything made a sound. The wet whisper of Salal, the tired squeak of Caleb's crutches where the rubber met slick duff. Tom's boot leather talking to old mud. No wind, no stars. The kind of night that holds secrets like a shell holds a tide pool. We stepped into a line someone else had drawn earlier, and that's when I saw the first new post. Fresh cedar, sap still crying from the cuts. The letters chewing light when our eyes adjusted. Stay away, deep as a promise. The shaved curls lay at the base like a little golden nest. Another post 20 yards beyond that, then 2 more. A standing row along the contour, all facing the same bad slope, all planted since sundown. I had to stop and look to keep from feeling superstitious about speed. Who carves that many warnings in a few hours? Who moves like water everywhere at once without leaving noise behind? Caleb touched one with his fingertips, the way you touch the shoulder of someone you don't want to startle. Tom lifted a palm and let it rest against the grain. 3 circles had been scratched behind the letters on one of them. Faint. Nested. Not the usual arcs and hatches I'd learned to watch for. I tucked that away without a label and moved. We kept to the alder edge and followed the kind of sign you only see when you've told your eyes to grow up. Duff scuffed low and wide, not hooves, not boots. Ferns bent and sprung back wrong. A place where moss remembered a wait. The creek down slope wore an extra noise, a little machine-sick hum that put a taste like pennies in my mouth. The fog thickened at the bad places, it always does, like it has a loyalty to the truth. We found the first camera before it found us. A cheap motion trap zip-tied to a sapling at chest height, its lens fogged with its own breath. Tom tilted it with 2 fingers and turned it into a view of nothing but bark. A little farther on, someone had screwed a trail cam into a fir with maddening confidence and set a smear of peanut butter on the trunk like an invitation for raccoons to become suspects. Caleb saw it, huffed a laugh that cost him, and kept moving. He knew the choreography, noise, claim, panic, and he knew we were late to the dance. The line of warning posts let us down like runway lights nobody paid for. We dropped into a shallow draw and the smell changed. That flat, ugly sting of ammonia cut with the high sweet of gas. It crawled up the back of my throat and made my eyes water. The creek's voice got thin and high, as if it was speaking through gritted teeth. We killed our lamps for the last 50 yards and let our feet learn the ground in the old way. Shapes showed themselves when we stopped asking. Buckets in a cluster, white turned gray by moss someone draped in a hurry. Hoses snaking into blackberry like domesticated eels. A blue tarp sagging across a stash built by men who assumed no one would look closely. Under the tarp, cylinders lay end to end, a row of sleeping metal. Caps and wire in a milk crate. Clay plugs in a plastic deli tub with the label torn half off. Something about a summer salad now ghosting explosives. Whoever had set this up lived in the church of good enough and tithed in other people's water. We weren't alone. You feel other bodies before you see them on nights like that. The hush breaks in a particular way. Voices came from the far side of the stash. Low, impatient. That Oregon flat hardware store tone turned mean by distance in the hour. "Pop the line for the pull," a man said. "We do it now, we're ghosts by dawn." Another guy complained about his boots. A third laughed too loud for a man who wants to go unnoticed. The kind of laugh that betrays a need to prove you're fine when your gut says otherwise. Tom angled us to the blind side, eyes already sketching exits. I pulled the camera from my chest pocket. No IR flash, no clicks. The sensor pulled what it could from fog and night. I went still and shot the way you would shoot a confession. Slow, steady, not hungry. Caps, wire, the little regulator discs like fat coins. A headlamp perched on a bucket. Gloves with fresh mud ground into the palms. A jacket with a slash of reflective tape, 3 dashes patterning across the cheap fabric, and a hand that couldn't stop fidgeting with a lighter. My throat clicked when I swallowed. The lighter's wheel sparked once, twice. It didn't catch. He pocketed it, bored with his own plan. Then a flashlight sliced the dark and lit us square, white and flat and total. I felt my pupils slam shut. Tom's hand found my shoulder. Caleb turned his head into his sleeve the way a wounded animal saves its good eye. "Hey!" a voice said, pleased to be the one who wins the find. "Who the—" And every light went out, not just their flashlights. Ours, the trail cams. A truck dome light I hadn't noticed across the draw. Everything electric blinked and died like a field had been thrown over the world. The darkness that rushed in was the old kind, the kind your great-great-grandfather would recognize, deep enough to make your bones feel transparent. And in it, wood spoke to wood. 3 even knocks from somewhere uphill. Another 3 from our left. Another 3 behind us, lower, closer. A draw we could walk if we let ourselves be led. The pattern moved like an invisible cord, tugging, inviting, insisting. The men by the stash swore and slapped their lights, hitting switches as if anger could turn the sun back on. "Who's there?" the reflective jacket guy demanded, because men like him think a voice can scare a forest. He stumbled, swore again when his shin found a bucket he didn't remember placing. The hum at the creek hiccuped hard enough to throw silence like a punch, then wobbled back with a sick little whine. The knocks ran again. 3, 3, 3, a corridor built of sound. "Follow it," Tom breathed without moving his mouth, his fingers squeezing my shoulder twice in the pattern I was already feeling in my ribs. We turned toward the last set and walked into dark the way you walk into a handshake. Caleb's crutches found earth where there should have been holes. Roots didn't grab his feet. Low branches lifted just enough that we passed under without losing skin. It felt like somebody bigger than any of us walked 5 paces ahead and took all the hard edges with them. Behind us, the men thrashed. Somebody kicked over a crate. Plastic clattered and rolled. Someone barked at someone else to find the main switch. The fog deepened like a curtain. The knocks moved again, always a length ahead, always to the side of the sour smell, always angling us toward air that didn't burn and ground that wouldn't give. We came out of the worst of it into a small saddle slick with old slides. The sound behind us changed. You know the breath a match takes just before it learns it's a flame? The intake, the tremble, the decision? Multiply it by 100 dumb choices. The pump choked once, then shuddered. The air filled with a hiss that didn't belong to weather. Tom pivoted, counting seconds in his head. Caleb stopped because the ground told him to. I turned because the camera at my chest was still a reflex, and in that half second of hesitation, I saw a beam of flashlight flare back to life down by the stash. A cone of white lancing the fog, jittering, catching on a cylinder label, a hand, the angry grin of someone who thinks he's got the night by the throat again. Then the air turned to heat without fire for half a breath, the way a giant opens an oven on your skin. A white flash popped under the tarp, quick and terrible, and the fog caught it and made it a room of light. Sound arrived late, as it always does when distances get strange. A dull whomp punched my chest. Another chased it. Buckets hopped like frogs. The tarp snapped and climbed the air before it shredded. Someone screamed a name that didn't want to be connected to a mother. The hum stopped. The creek paused as if it were listening for instructions. I moved before the reason could stop me. Down slope, toward the stupid light, toward the place where the fog had turned itself into a backlit sheet showing silhouettes you don't ever want to put faces to. Tom cursed my given name in a way that meant love and followed, angling to cut me off if the ground went loose. Caleb shouted the only word that mattered, no. But the knocks ran hard now. 333, not ahead this time, but all around, bracketing the bad with offensive sound. I took it as permission or as absolution, I don't know which. He lay half under the edge of the tarp, headlamp miraculously still on his forehead, reflective tape flashing nonsense. The blast had thrown him but not buried him. A cylinder had rolled and pinned his thigh. His glove was gone. His hand was a mess of wet and grit and shock. He was breathing too fast and too shallow, the way men do when their bodies want to leave without them. I reached for the cylinder first because weight is a sentence, and the ground in me knew how to lift. Tom shouldered in with me, set his back and his legs and the old stubbornness he keeps like a tool. Together we made the metal move. "Don't leave me," the man said, and it was so nakedly human I wanted to look away. "Don't." He sucked air and coughed, and the cough had little black flecks in it. I wanted to hate him. I didn't get to. Not yet. I hooked my hands under his armpits and dragged inch by inch until his legs cleared the worst of the spill and he lay on a patch of ground that didn't belong to anyone. "Can you walk?" Tom asked, and the man managed something like yes that sounded like please. Behind us, a second cylinder hissed in a long exhale, then quieted. Nothing else blew. Luck or mercy or both. We pulled him uphill, toward the knocks, away from the ammonia, away from the simple story about monsters someone had rehearsed all afternoon. The men who hadn't gone down with the blast stumbled out of the fog one by one, faces ghosted by their own beams, eyes shocked wide in that way people get when the night answers back. Nobody pointed a camera, nobody bragged. The knocks drove us like sheepdogs. 333, each set a little farther toward clean air. Each set a little quieter, as if to say you're learning. Now do the rest yourself. We broke into a clear patch under alder. The sky had softened from black to something like the inside of a shell. My lungs found a way to breathe without doing math about poison. The man we dragged lay shaking, headlamp crooked, mouth open, dew beading his beard. He stared at nothing with the intensity of someone trying to rebuild a world from bricks he'd just learned were clay. Dawn took its time. When it finally reached down into that draw and touched the wreck, what it showed wasn't a war movie. It was small, dumb violence. The tarp in ribbons, ash sifting like slow rain, plastic pocked and shriveled. cylinders lying like bad ideas that wouldn't die, a slick on the water that the day would make look pretty if you didn't know what beauty can hide, and on a charred stump where the heat had licked and walked on. A mark I didn't recognize at first because my head was still in the night. 3 circles cut into the black, a small one nested in a larger, steady and centered and clean where everything else was chaos. Not words, not a shout. A sentence you feel in your sternum, remember. Keep. Far. Tom saw it the same breath I did. Caleb eased forward on his crutches, took it in and let out a sound that wasn't pain exactly. Behind us, a stray bucket rocked and settled. A jay threw one rude note and then thought better of it. The man we'd pulled out cried once, quiet and quick like a hiccup, and then shut his eyes as if closing them could turn him into the kind of person who hadn't needed saving. The day opened around us in pale, stubborn gray. The knocks didn't come again. They didn't need to. We were far enough for now, and the rest of the line, the one that runs between telling and protecting, was waiting where the fog thinned and the road began. The timeline looked like a heartbeat. White bars stacked against black, sound riding underneath like a distant train. I had the perfect cut sitting on my screen at 2:11 a.m. in a motel off Highway 26 where the ice machine hiccuped and the hall smelled like bleach. The clip opened on fog and those 3 measured knocks calling across the timber. It held on the men in reflective tape, their hands on stolen cylinders and caps. It caught the flash under the tarp, the buckled air, the way a body becomes very small when the ground corrects a lie. Then it showed what people love to watch. Us dragging a man out of the blast radius, breath-ripping, faces grim, the patient hero shot no one wants to admit they crave. I slid the playhead. My finger found the little blue button that would send it everywhere at once. Upload waited like a dare. I pressed and stopped. The night in the room deepened without the lights changing. Somewhere behind the thin wall, a TV sold a miracle ladder to a man who couldn't sleep. I set my finger on the mouse, felt my own pulse thud under bone, and took it away. I closed the edit and opened a blank document that didn't care about ratings. I wrote like a mechanic. Location, date, coordinates, evidence of illegal blasting in the Mount Hood National Forest. Caps, wire, unpermitted cylinders. Sheen observed on water surface downstream, odor consistent with ammonia and gas. I wrote what Bone had told me, microfractures that don't match teeth, compression that belongs to rock and shock, not claws. I attached stills of hose lines dressed with ferns, a headlamp propped on a bucket, the corner of a tarp pulled just wide enough to stop pretending. I left out hands that weren't human. I left out eyes that had looked at me and chosen mercy over myth. I sent the packet to the people who could make a case without dragging a secret into the morning news. State DEQ, USFS law enforcement, the county DA who hates being lied to more than he loves a camera. No hashtags, no channel watermark, no bait for a comment section. My phone vibrated on the motel desk. A message from Caleb, timestamped too late to be healthy. A link to his channel, then a second message that only said, "It's gone." I opened the link out of habit and watched it serve me a polite error about a deleted video. His last upload, all those views waiting, all that leverage, gone like breath on glass. He followed with a selfie that was half hospital gown, half crooked grin, a thumbs up he didn't quite sell. Beneath his wristband, fresh cordage looped twice, bark fiber pale against skin. "I made a promise," he wrote. "I'm keeping it." I typed back something that didn't use the word proud because he hadn't asked for that. I told him I'd visit when they let him eat something that tastes like food. He sent me a half-second video instead, his knuckles tapping a bedside tray, 3 clean beats, small and stubborn. I played it twice and let it sit in my chest until the motel air felt less cheap. At dawn, the fog lifted and left the world raw. We drove back to the bowl where the bones had sat like a sentence. Tom at the wheel, no radio, just the heater trying to make our breath look less like ghosts. Morning put edges on everything it touched. The torn slope, the nurse logs, the narrow lip where I'd stood and counted fractures like a confession. He carried a cedar sapling he'd cut clean and debarked smooth, longer than he liked to admit he could lift. I carried cordage I hadn't woven but understood with my hands now. The twist and lay, the way bark becomes rope when you ask it right. We set the pole in the place where ground decides whether it holds or gives. He carved slow, measured. Not the English this time, not for us. He marked the wood with the arcs and crosshatches I'd learned to recognize and not to repeat. He brushed ash across his fingertips from a tin I knew lived under his truck seat, ash he'd kept since a fire he didn't talk about much. He touched a small gray smudge to the wood and then to his own forehead. He didn't ask me. He simply held the tin like an invitation and waited. I reached. The ash was cool. It smelled faintly of old cedar, older sorrow. I pressed a thumb to my brow and felt something unclench in a room I hadn't realized I still kept locked. We braided a length of bark together and wrapped it near the base, a ring bright against the raw cedar. Not decoration, a promise. He spoke without using all the words. That he'd carried a wrong choice long enough. That the quiet way can be the strong way if you keep your feet on it. That we were not building a shrine for a legend, but a marker for a person whose days had ended in a burst of bad decisions and falling rock. We set a small pile of found bones on a flat of stone and laid a single fern over them the way other people lay a field flag. I didn't pray. I listened. Water below us kept telling the only story it knows. Move, remember, find the low line. Word got out about the blast anyway, the way it always does. Midday, a local station ran a clip of tape strung across a spur road and a deputy telling campers to keep moving. Nobody said the name of a tribe out loud because nobody had a name to say. Online, a handful of loud accounts spun the bathroom door gouges into a saga about monsters. A smaller handful asked why the creek had turned slick under a particular bend after a week of clear weather. May texted me a photo of a confiscated stash tarped in the bed of a county flatbed. Cylinders, coils of wire, a crate of clay caps like a picnic gone wrong. Paperwork started, she wrote. Keep breathing. Tom poured coffee from a thermos that had more miles on it than some trucks. We stood there in our boots and didn't answer any of the calls we couldn't help. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and the weight of what stays unsaid. The house was the kind that creaks when a cloud thinks about moving. I wrote the report that would actually change something, boring, careful, bulletproof. The blowout where the slide had loosened after midnight. The times that matched complaints. The map May had smudged with pencil and trust. I thought about the email I hadn't sent from the motel, the one that would have given 100 strangers the story they thought they wanted. I dragged it into a folder named for a species we still pretend we know, and I closed the folder. After dark, the neighborhood went to bed in stages. One garage door, a little dog offended by a leaf. The train a mile away whistling at the same crossing it always does. I washed my hands and watched the sink water run gray where cedar dust had settled into the lines of my palms. I dried them on the dish towel that never quite gets clean. That's when I heard it. Faint. Far. 3 knocks from somewhere out beyond the greenbelt where kids build forts in summer and owls argue over shows we don't get. The sound came again. Softer, as if the night itself tapped a knuckle on the side of the world. I didn't move to the window. I didn't test it. I let the house carry it through the framing and into me. Someone, somewhere was taking attendance. I turned back to the table. There, on top of the map and the legal pad, lay a coil of fresh bark cord, pale and neat, ends tucked like a careful seam. No mud on the floor, no open window. Just the smell of cedar, clean and green and not from the thermos, and a single fleck of soot I hadn't made drifting down as if a thumb had just left it behind. My first breath was shock that felt like joy. My second was the old careful caution that has kept me alive. I reached out and touched the braid with 2 fingers the way you touch a sleeping child's hair. Light, so as not to break anything that isn't yours. I don't know how they move where we don't see them. I don't know how long they'd been deciding whether we had earned the right to be taught a smaller story instead of the loud one. I do know this. Some minds choose silence, not because they can't speak, but because they want us to learn the border by feeling it underfoot. Respect is a language. You don't get fluent by shouting. I turned the coil once around my wrist and then set it back where it had been placed, in the exact circle it had made of itself. I wrote one last line on the report I'd send in the morning, a sentence about remediation and monitoring, the kind of words that let people with clipboards move budgets and dirt. The rest of the story, the one with ash and a forehead, with knocks that mean safe and knocks that mean danger, with a hand that lifted a camera and turned it to face a doorway, I kept. Not because I'm afraid of being called a fool. Because some doors don't need our feet. Outside, something big moved the air without touching the fence. The wind carried cedar and rain and the faintest hint of smoke that wasn't from any chimney on my street. I waited for one more sound and got it, not close, not meant to startle. 3 gentle taps from the dark that answered nothing and promised everything I could stand to understand. I let the room go quiet around it. I let myself stay there in the space between telling and keeping until the coffee went cold and the coil of bark held its shape on my table like a note from a neighbor who knows where I live and wanted me to know they noticed I finally learned how to listen. Sometimes the most important truths are not shouted from mountaintops or printed in headlines. They're carried quietly from one heart to another like a small flame that only grows when it's sheltered from the wind. In the noise of the world, it's easy to believe that the biggest impact comes from the loudest voice. But again and again, life reminds us that real change often happens in silence. In the unspoken decisions, the unrecorded acts of kindness, the moments when we choose to protect rather than expose. Every path we walk leaves traces. Some are visible like footprints in the mud after rain. Others are invisible, imprinted only in the people we've met, the lives we've touched, the trust we've either earned or lost. We are all in our own way keepers of stories, some meant to be shared, others meant to be guarded until the world is ready. The wisdom lies in knowing the difference. There will always be those who measure worth in attention, in the number of eyes watching, in the rush of being seen. But there is a deeper, quieter worth in choosing what not to reveal, in understanding that some truths belong to more than just us and that holding them with care can be the purest form of respect. We may never know the full shape of the mysteries that move through our lives, but perhaps that's not the point. Perhaps the point is learning to live alongside them without breaking what we cannot repair. Kindness, like trust, is fragile. It grows slowly, sometimes over years, built on choices we make when no one else is watching. To protect something rare is to believe that its existence matters more than our proof of it. And in a world obsessed with evidence, it takes courage to say, I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and that's enough for me. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. Not all treasures are meant to be displayed. Some are meant to be kept safe so they can keep existing at all. We each hold a part of that responsibility, whether we realize it or not. Thank you for spending this time, for listening closely, for walking alongside the edges of what can be told. Your presence here matters more than you might think. If this story has stirred something in you, whether it's wonder, doubt, or just the urge to look at the world a little differently, share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what you felt, what you believe, and what you'd choose to protect. And if you want to be here for more stories like this, the kind that live between fact and feeling, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and keep the conversation alive. Because the story never truly ends, it just waits for the next person willing to listen.